All right, so world of ideas. We're going to move on with some of the E's now. Uh, the next one up, again, I'm skipping people, the people in it, is elements, comma, the four. So the four elements. And I wouldn't you do this normally, but I think it might come up in some of like the history or some other things. So I'm going to go over this because I think it might show up somewhere else. So the four elements in ancient cosmologies, particularly Greek and Indian, the four basic irreducible substances. That was weird. That constitute all matter: earth, air, fire, and water. Irreducible, cannot be reduced. That's it. Once you break everything down as much as you can, these are the four things that everything is composed out of. The modern understanding of chemical elements, those substances composed of only one kind of atom, has in common with the ancient concept the basic principle of irreducibility. In the Greek tradition, each element was distinguished by a particular motion. Air and fire moved naturally upward, fire more so than air. Water and earth settled, earth more so. The first Greek to base his system on all four elements was Empedocles, sorry, Empedocles, in the 5th century BCE. Previous thinkers had recognized a single element as the fundamental principle of the world. The earliest Thales had considered it to be water, out of which the other elements were formed, and for this attempt to capture the multiplicity of the world in a unifying principle, he is sometimes called the first philosopher. For Anaximenes, the basic principle was air, which assumed other forms through condensation and rarefaction. And for Heraclitus, whose theory stressed flux and change, it was fire, an emphasis adopted by the Stoics. Water, air, and fire were also variously identified as fundamental in the Indian Vedic tradition. The 7th century Hindu philosopher Shankara ranked the four elements according to their subtlety, or susceptibility to the senses, air being the most subtle, since it cannot be seen, tasted, or smelled, but only felt. The ancient Chinese distinguished 5 elements, or phases: water, fire, earth, metal, and wood. There's also, I'm going to read the last couple here, but also there's a lot of indigenous American ways of thought that use the four elements as well. And as a side note, you might see these things in like the circle with a cross, or the Chinese ones, you see basically a circle with a 5-pointed star in the middle. It's not meant to be, oh, this is creepy devil worship or anything. No, what it's describing is that each element will create each other. So if we use the Chinese one, which I use for like my Tai Chi stuff, is, if metal's here, water can condense on metal. So metal generates water. Water feeds wood. Wood feeds fire. Fire helps enrich an earth. Metal comes out of earth. So they all create each other. But if you see the cross stuff coming, either the 4 of them that's a cross or the star, it's that each one can also negatively affect another as well. So metal as an axe can chop wood. Wood breaks up earth. Earth can dam water. Water quenches fire. Fire melts metal. So it's the interaction, the interplay of all these, as opposed to something scary. Before Aristotle, the elements were considered immutable. He assigned them the contrasting qualities hot, cold, and moist, dry. Earth was dry and cold, air moist and hot, fire hot and dry, water cold and moist. And theorized that any element could change into any other with which it had a quality in common. For example, air into fire as both are hot. The ideas of mutability became the basis of alchemy, which sought to turn the base metals, such as lead, into gold or silver. To the 4 earthly elements, Aristotle added a 5th, the ether, of which the celestial sphere is composed. Okay, there's a lot to unpack in that. Also, side note, if you break down sort of, again, the sort of Chinese Taoist cosmology, you have the Wuji of nothing, then the Taiji, which is like the one thing that breaks up in the yin and yang. Yin and yang will also break down into greater and lesser. So you have greater, lesser yin, greater, lesser yang. So it kind of breaks down with that too. I'm going to kind of skip around. The ether, what they mean is the celestial sphere is composed so outside of the earth. So space, the sort of stuff in between everything. It was the sort of, not magical thing, but it was the sort of fabric of space beyond the earth. Now remember, it's like they think the world is it, and outside of that was like the ether, and that was kind of the stuff that everything went in. Some people and cultures will also, instead of ether, use spirit as that fifth element. Now, to go back into something, they said that the mutability became the basis of alchemy. Yeah. Couple things. Alchemy, if it's just seen as the base metals turning from lead to gold or silver, this is incorrect. It doesn't matter if it's coming from out of Egypt and Greece and then, you know, Europe in the Middle Ages, or out of China with the Taoists. Alchemy is an allegory. It is a symbol for the perfection of the person. So you take the base thing, which is like your body and your conditioned, diseased mind, and through practice and meditation and all this other stuff, depending upon what culturally is appropriate, you turn yourself into something more precious. You're getting rid of all the sort of garbage on you and in you, and what's left when you're able to do that is that sort of enlightened being. Some people did pursue it in a strictly material sense. There's stories of, you know, coming out of the Taoist in China, for example. It's more sort of like visceral example. They would use different kind of symbolism for it. You know, they would talk about, you know, taking lead and cinnabar and mercury and the mixture of that, and then, you know, swallow that, and, you know, after 10 months of incubation, the pearl of immortality. Well, people were actually doing that, and they died awfully, because you're not supposed to eat any of those things. It's very bad. But those were all symbols. You know, mercury was a symbol for the mind. Lead and cinnabar had different symbolisms in terms of different parts of the body and different parts of using things. And then the pearl of immortality wasn't an actual literal thing that they made like a philosopher's stone. That was like you. So the idea of turning base metal to gold, that was like a very surface level, that was meant to sort of be an analogy and an allegory for the evolution, sort of mentally, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually, the evolution and enlightenment of a person. Also, you know, the way that they're sort of talking about this is the basis for alchemy. The basis of alchemy was Egypt, because the actual name for Egypt is Kemet, which is like the black soil, the black land. The name Egypt is a Greek name, Aegyptus, of an Egyptian city, Hakupta. And then that got translated through the Greek. So most of the names that you know, Memphis, Luxor, even the names, if you know, like Isis and Osiris and Horus, you know, those are Nephthys, those are Greek versions of the actual Egyptian names. So we had Kemet from Egypt, and then there were certain, again, sort of spiritual practices that they do, as well as actual sort of chemical and scientific practice they had. But the thing with Egypt, if you like, especially if you read John Anthony West, is all that stuff was together. That would be considered by the late John Anthony West as a true civilization, because art, government, science, and like the religion and philosophy, it was all tied in together as one thing. So that's where the basis of alchemy is, in terms of the actual word, and kind of where some of that comes from. Last bit. The Aristotelian view of the elements survived until the 17th century when Robert Boyle proposed the theory of primitive and simple, perfectly unmingled bodies, many more than four, that combine to form chemical compounds. By the early 19th century, this approach had given rise to the modern classification of atomic elements. So Robert Boyle might be someone you probably need to know from the 1600s, talking about now we're getting into atoms as we sort of think of atoms now. All right, so I'm going to kind of cut it off with that there, because I did kind of get into a lot of other stuff. So there's kind of a lot in that that might come up in some other things. Maybe not as much the Chinese stuff, but some of the other stuff might come up, especially in like history, and we're starting to get into kind of history of science, a little bit of that too. Thank you.